All right, and we are live. Thank you everyone for joining. We're gonna get started here in just a little bit. We just want people to kind of make sure that they've been able to log on, get ready to go. And yeah, so we're just gonna give it 1 minute here. And then we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us. All right. Kind of gave people that little buffer window. So we're going to go ahead and start. We've got some amazing people here tonight. So to everybody watching, thank you for joining. And to our panelists, thank you as well. My name is Jacob Thomas. I am our communications director at Common Defense. Common Defense is the nation's largest organization of progressive veterans doing grassroots work across the country. And we've been around for just over 5 years now. I served in the United States Air Force from 2008 to 2016. I was a network engineer and then did sexual assault work and have been doing LGBTQ organizing and veterans organizing for a little over a decade now. I'm also joined with my counterpart in this work, Naveed Shah. So Naveed Shah is our political director at Common Defense. U.S. Army veteran, was in and served under Operation Iraqi Freedom, and has been doing this work for a long time as well, and is doing a lot of amazing stuff for Common Defense and veterans across the country out in DC now. And then I'm joined with Aisha Juman, who is the president of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. She has over 30 years of experience in public health, and is now doing great work at the foundation. And then our last panelist tonight is Hassan. Hassan is the legislative director for Middle East policy with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And the Friends Committee is the nation's is a nonpartisan Quaker organization that lobbies Congress and administrations to advance peace, justice, and environmental stewardship, and is the oldest peace lobby in our nation's history. So thank you all for joining us. And after that brief intro, I want to turn it directly over to Aisha for a slide deck on kind of the history of what got us to here.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you to Common Defense for inviting me and Hassan to be with you. And thank you to everybody who joined today to hear the presentation. Okay. So as to give a background into the war in Yemen, which I call the forgotten war because nobody wants to talk about it, or actually a more accurate term is the blacked out war. I always like to start my presentation with showing people how beautiful Yemen is. The first picture here is the city of Sana'a. It's the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It dates back to about 5,000 years, and Yemeni think that it was built by Noah, by Sam, the son of Noah. So Yemen has a beautiful history, beautiful agriculture and culture, and the buildings in Yemen are very stunning. I also want to show the map of Yemen just to show the strategic importance of Yemen to not just countries in the region, but internationally. So Yemen controls this strait here, which is called Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. We are bordered by Saudi Arabia to the south and Oman to the east. Yemen has large water access. And so the strategic importance of Yemen to the international community is the majority of oil that comes from Saudi Arabia actually has to pass through this Bab el-Mandeb. And in a way, it's been a curse because a lot of countries have tried to conquer Yemen for that reason. So I'll describe a little bit parties of the conflict, and I use the UN report for definitions. So it's going to be at least consistent in defining all the different actors who are fighting in Yemen. The first one is Ali Abdullah Saleh. He was the president of Yemen for 33 years until 2011, when the Arab Spring occurred and there were a lot of protests. And following 10 months of protests, he resigned, and that resignation was brokered by the Gulf Corporation Council, and he was given full immunity from prosecution. He backed the Houthis against the Saudi-led assault, and he was killed by the Houthi in a fighting with them in December 2017. The second main group is the Houthis. The Houthis belong to a Zaydi sect of Shia Islam. They are often described by Saudi Arabia as being backed by Shia majority Iran, but they are primarily a local group. In the early 2000s, the Houthis formed a rebel group and fought 6 wars against the government of Saleh and its key allies, Saudi Arabia. They seized the capital Sana'a in September 2014 and put President Hadi under house arrest in January 2015. So Iran, we hear about Iran all the time as the conflict in Yemen. As far as the conflict in Yemen, Iran is widely reported to be pulling the strings of the Houthis in their fight against Saudi-backed government. Remember, this is from UN reports. Beyond media reports about weapons and money being sent, there is little evidence that support the claims that the Saudis have. Tehran has celebrated, however, the Houthi advances within Yemen and loudly criticized Saudi Arabia. Abdurrabbu Hadi Mansour was the president of Yemen. He was elected in a one-man race in 2012. He was supposed to be a president for 2 years. And he ended up being a president for over a decade. He was Saleh deputy and took over in 2012. In January 2015, when the Houthi took over Sana'a, they placed him under house arrest. He resigned, and then in February, after fleeing to Aden, he withdrew his resignation and escaped to Saudi Arabia. On April 7 of this year, Hadi ceded his powers to an 8-member presidential council that was by the Saudi, which is actually, by the way, is unconstitutional based on Yemen constitution. A foreign country cannot form a presidential council or elect a president in Yemen. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal saying Saudi Arabia pushed Yemen elected president to step aside, Saudi and Yemeni officials say. And this is from the Wall Street Journal that is very conservative. Then we have the Saudi Arabia and the coalition. Saudi Arabia launched airstrikes in March of 2015 under the tag Operation Decisive Storm against the Houthi rebels, whom it regards as proxy to regional nemesis Iran. Airstrikes initially backed by several countries, including United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Qatar, and Sudan. All countries except Saudi Arabia and UAE left the coalition. So what led to the war? So despite the international backing of Hadi in 2012 up to 2014, he was too weak. Pressure from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund forced the Yemeni government to lift subsidies on fuel in about July and August of 2014. So there were a lot of demonstrations and strikes against the government. Houthi and Saleh exploited the situation to undermine Hadi in March 2015 after several rounds of peace negotiations. The UN envoy to Yemen announced that the Yemeni factions were on the verge of a power-sharing deal. Saudi Arabia ignored the announcement and, backed by the US and the UK, launched an air campaign against Yemen. And this is an article, again, from the Wall Street Journal, April 2015. It says, former UN envoy says Yemen political deal was closed before Saudi airstrikes began. Actually, at that point in time, they were negotiating where to sign the agreement between the different factions in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia had offered to host the signing in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh. And so the Houthis were not very keen on going to Saudi Arabia for the signing of the agreement. And as Jamal bin Umar was in Sana'a, negotiating were signed agreement, the Saudi airstrikes were launched on Yemen. So stated reasons for the war based on the Saudi on March 26, Saudi Arabia and several allied started their airstrike. Presumably, they said to protect the legitimate government and reverse the takeover by Houthis. They also imposed a blockade on Yemen air, water, and land. However, although they said that Hadi had requested this, Hadi, in an interview post the airstrikes, said that he had no idea that the Saudis were going to start airstrikes against Yemen. Saudi also expressed concern of Iran influence on their southern border. So this is an interview with President Obama in July 14, 2015 about Saudi concerns over the Iran deal. He said, America has to listen to our Sunni Arab allies, but also not fall into the trap of letting them blame every problem on Iran. And this is a quote also from Obama, Houthis in Yemen. I think the Iranian involvement has been initially overstated. When we see our intelligence, we don't get a sense that Iran was strategically thinking, let's march the Houthi into Sana'a. It was more of an indicator of the weakness of the government in Yemen. And actually, reports after that showed that Iran had tried to dissuade the Houthis from marching into Sana'a, and they didn't listen to that. This is another article from the New York Times. It says US and Iran both conflict and converge. And here are a few things that I got from the article. Quotes, Houthis as proxies for Iran. These constants report that the Houthis are working for the Iranians are nonsense. They've been fighting Al-Qaeda since at least 2012, and they've been winning. Why are we fighting a movement that's fighting Al-Qaeda? This is Michael Horton, Yemen expert. And I actually attest to that because the area where I was born was controlled by Al-Qaeda, and the Houthis were able to push them out of that area. The United States has dissented from Saudi claims that Iran is controlling the Houthis. There is little evidence that the Iranians have provided significant military support to the Houthis or exercised significant control over the group. This is April Ali, a researcher within the International Crisis Group. This is from the Washington Post by Thomas Juneau, who is not a friend of the Houthis and always criticizes them. He says, no, Yemeni Houthis actually are not Iranian puppets. So what are other reasons for the Saudi war on Yemen? I'll share a few also quotes. Saudi King Salman ascended to the throne 2 months before the military campaign was launched. The operation is being overseen by his 30-year-old son, who is second in line to the throne, but rumored to be eager to get the crown quicker. To prove his mettle, he has to achieve some sort of victory in Yemen. You could argue this whole Yemen operation was in part calculated to shore up the defense minister's profile. And I actually agree with this assessment, and I think this is the primary reason why Mohammed bin Salman entered into a war in Yemen. He also said it will only take 4 to 8 weeks maximum. When that didn't happen, he then had a coup against his cousin, who was the next in line to be king in Saudi Arabia. But also we have the German intelligence, which they never share anything in public. German spy agencies warns of Saudi intervention destabilizing Arab world. German Foreign Intelligence Agency, BND, has released a disparaging report on Saudi Arabia. Their assessment says the country is destabilizing the Middle East with proxy wars in Yemen and elsewhere in the region. So the Saudi airstrikes and blockade started in March 2015, and it has committed many violations. This is from Human Rights Watch in October 2015. And since then, there have been a lot more war crimes committed by the Saudi with support from the US government. So we've seen indiscriminate attacks on civilian, use of intentionally banned cluster munitions, and the coalition-imposed blockade may amount to starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, a war crime. The blockade on Yemen still exists today, and we have 19 million people in Yemen today who are food insecure. I'll stop here in terms of sharing. I do want of slides. I do want to mention that we have a truce that's started on April 2nd, has been renewed. This is the third time, and every time it's renewed for 2 months. The truce stopped the Saudi airstrikes in Yemen that were happening daily since March 2015. In return, they allowed some fuel ships to go through Hodeidah and allowed 2 flights from Sana'a airport that they had closed. I don't think, you know, depriving people of their basic rights, like having fuel and travel from the national airport, is something that should be used to hold a whole country hostage. But that's what happened. And the truce is welcome. We're happy with it, but it should, I think, end up being a peace process, including all Yemeni into it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaman, for that lovely presentation, kind of giving us the background and the context of kind of how we get to today. And then Hassan, I want to turn it over to you to help kind of lead us on the current kind of legislative space that we exist in, both with the US's complicity in this war and kind of what is happening in that process right now as we move forward.
Well, thank you so much. Always appreciate sharing. Can you all hear me okay? Am I cutting out?
You cut out just a bit there at the start, but it seems to have gotten better.
Okay, cool. I just closed down another program, so if there's any issues, just let me know. So. Yeah, what I should just said was really important context and background. I'd like to get into the U.S. role, specifically talk a little bit about what Congress has done to kind of push back on U.S. support, and then sort of what's going on right now in Congress and how it relates to the ongoing truce, if that's all right. Aisha did talk about how the U.S. and the U.K. Have been involved in the war. The Saudi-led coalition's war in Yemen has received almost unwavering military support and weapon sales from the United States, the UK, but also France, Canada, and other Western countries. In 2015, the Obama administration accommodated Saudi Arabia's request for military backing of the coalition's war in Yemen. I think it's worth noting that at the same time, they were trying to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, and I think they felt like they were in a vulnerable position. Obviously, FCNL, we really support diplomacy with Iran, but unfortunately, it has come at a great cost of the Yemeni people. Such backing has included targeting assistance, logistical support for coalition airstrikes, mid-air refueling for Saudi warplanes, spare parts transfers, and literally billions of dollars of weapon sales. There was a GAO report that I'll talk a little bit more about in a few moments here, but it indicated that we've sold almost $60 billion worth of military assistance to the Saudi-led coalition, to Saudi Arabia and the UAE since the start of the war, which is a really obscene amount of weapon sales. So on February 4th, 2021, President Biden announced that the United States was going to end support for the coalition's offensive operations in Yemen. And this was really, a hard-fought win by a lot of people, but unfortunately, the administration didn't clearly define what constitutes offensive operations, and really critical components of U.S. complicity remain. And the administration verified that ongoing support includes maintenance and intelligence sharing for warplanes conducting airstrikes, enforcing the air and sea blockade of Yemen. They supposedly stopped the offensive intel sharing, specifically the targeting assistance, but there's still this intelligence cooperation and really the critical spare parts and maintenance that keep the Saudi air fleet going. They could not function without these daily transfers. Almost every time an F-15 lands, which is primarily like the main jet that the Saudi squadrons use. They need to get these replacement tires and all these different components. And there's a large DoD footprint and contractor footprint that's involved in that process. There was a detailed letter. This was not for lack of trying. Congress tried to figure out exactly what was going on. Was the blockade considered an offensive operation? We still don't know. There's many experts, working on this issue. Bruce Rydell, Aisha Juman, a whole bunch of people, and we all want, consider the blockade to be an offensive operation, but we really don't have that definition right now. Again, I mentioned that GAO report. I already told you that $60 billion was sold to the Saudi coalition in the form of weapon sales, but there were two other key pieces. The other parts are, we don't know how the weapons are being used. There's mass civilian casualties happening. The UN has reported that nearly 500,000 people have been killed since the start of this war. Some say that's actually a really conservative estimate. 60% due to starvation and disease, perpetuated by things like the Saudi blockade on Yemen. But we still don't know how these weapons are being used. Also, we also learned that the State Department doesn't have a definition for what offensive or defensive actually is, even though they're justifying certain weapon sales using that terminology. So we've got serious problems here to kind of to solve. So in the past, in 2019, Congress made history. I would say led by people like Aisha Juman, veterans around the country, Yemeni groups, faith-based groups, libertarians. I like to say our coalition spans from Rand Paul to the Raging Grannies. We have quite the coalition here. And it really, galvanized so many people. And we were able, for the first time in U.S. history, pass a war powers resolution to cut off this military assistance to the Saudi-led coalition. The main thrust of that bill, SJ Res 7, was to cut off mid-air refueling. Trump ended up vetoing that bill, but still carried out the policy of the legislation by ending the mid-air refueling, and that mid-air refueling has stopped to this day. So there are, more. There's more to go, but that was a significant victory. And I also think it's important to say, okay, we passed this legislation, but what actually happened on the ground? The advocacy effort obviously mobilized hundreds of thousands of activists all around the country to produce this bipartisan majority in the House and Senate. But it also pushed the UAE to draw down its forces in Yemen. It spurred a reduction in cross-border attacks by both the Saudis and the Houthis, led to the Hodeidah ceasefire. There was a previous version. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there was a 2018 version that just passed the Senate. And right after that, there was the Hodeidah ceasefire. There was revived negotiations between the warring parties. But unfortunately, after that veto and after congressional negotiators stripped some key provisions out of the National Defense Authorization Act, we saw an uptick in violence. And that, to me, tells me a real critical lesson here is that when Congress and the American people say, no, we don't want to support this war, we're going to, rein in the executive branch, rein diplomacy, move ahead. And I'll just note that in the 117th Congress, we have a new live effort, 2 bills in the House and Senate, SJ Res 56 and HJ Res 87. That's led by Senator Sanders, Warren, and Leahy on the Senate side, and then Reps Jayapal, Schiff, DeFazio, and Mace on the House side. And that has robust support already. We've got 114 co-sponsors in the House. So we have already, just in co-sponsors, over half of all the votes that we actually even need to pass this thing. So we've got a lot of momentum here. And it's just worth noticing that the truce was, that original April truce was agreed to as Congress started clamoring for, an ending to this U.S. participation. It's clearly not the only reason. Folks at the UN have been working hard. Peace builders in Yemen have been working hard. but Congress plays a key role too, and I think we have to acknowledge that. So again, we have a lot of leverage here that we need to use to extend this truce and revive these peace talks. Lawmakers. A lot of people will say that lawmakers have to get the Houthis to behave in a certain way. There's been lots of people speaking out about that, but unfortunately, we don't have a ton of leverage with Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis, right now. Because we're not giving them weapons, we just don't have a lot of leverage there. We do have leverage with the Saudi-led coalition, and as a U.S.-based organization, working in the public interest here, I feel like that's my mandate as a U.S. citizen to try to make sure that my country is not complicit in any war crimes in Yemen. So by making clear that the U.S. won't resume military support to Riyadh and its partners in the war, Congress can keep the pressure on the warring parties, prevent this peace process from getting derailed. It's also critical that we send a message to the Biden administration that they need to honor their promise to end blind support for a Saudi Arabian regime intent on cracking down on dissidents at home and destroying Yemen. In Biden's own words, to end the sale of material to the Saudis where they're going in and murdering children in Yemen. So I don't think that the U.S. can unilaterally end this war. There's a long road to peace, a long road to peace building. We have to support organizations like Aisha Juman. She's does incredible. We haven't really talked about all the great humanitarian aid work that she's doing on the ground with Yemeni peace builders. So this is not an international organization. This is Yemenis helping Yemenis, and that's really, I think, how we get to peace. But we, as U.S. citizens, providing this military support by making clear that we're not going to keep this war going, it really leaves the Saudi Arabian government only one option, is that they have to negotiate an end to this conflict and finally end the blockade, and move this process forward. So thank you so much for giving us the time, and thank you so much to Common Defense for being a core partner in this coalition. You are helping us with these letters, helping us with this advocacy effort, and really your voice and the voice of veterans are an absolute critical part of this anti-war movement.
Yes, thank you for that, Hassan. We are very proud and happy to be in this fight. And speaking of that veteran-led work, I want to turn it over to Naveed. I do want to say briefly, as people are kind of watching, if you do have comments, or if you're on Facebook or on YouTube, you can comment on the video, and we'll be able to see that. And we will be doing some Q&A in just a bit. So you can go ahead and start thinking about those questions, put those in the chat, or save them and put them in the chat in a few moments when we get to that portion. But I wanted to kind of make sure that people understood that was an option. And then, Naveed, our political director.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Hassan, and thanks, Aisha, so much for joining us today to talk about this important issue. The question I got from a few folks when they heard that we were working on this, coalition around the Yemen War Powers legislation was, oh, well, America doesn't have troops on the ground in Yemen, so why is that important to us? And I feel like it's really important that we lay out kind of how we got here as an organization, as a group of veterans. Many of us, like myself, who served in Iraq, and those who served in Afghanistan and many other places over the past 20 years, America has had troops deployed into 40 countries around the world. So while we might not necessarily have been on the ground in Yemen, we know many of us have seen firsthand what the devastating effects of war can have on local populations. We often talk about how it affects veterans and military families here at home. The after effects of war, what happens to people and their families when soldiers return, and how they have to deal with post-traumatic stress and all types of other illnesses and injuries. But the fact is that we volunteered for that. We took an oath to this Constitution and put on that uniform and decided that that's what we wanted to do. The people on the ground in those countries did not volunteer for it, right? They're stuck in the middle of this crossfire. They don't really have a choice. about who's going to drop bombs and where they're going to land. So for them, it's imperative that if justice is, a part of our DNA as Americans, then the justice we should have to fight for is for those who cannot fight for it at all. Yemen, the situation there, as Aisha laid out beautifully for us, it is a complex situation. Of course, there's many different reasons why it started, why it's happening. But at the end of the day, U.S. taxpayer dollars are being used to fund this conflict, and it is hurting millions and millions of people. We've already seen what happens when you go into these places. In Iraq, where I served, many years ago, many moons ago. I'm not that old, but it feels like a long time ago. And I think there was about 5 million refugees who were displaced in Iraq at one point. And even now today, there are still hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Iraqis who are in acute need of assistance, of food and water, and basic necessities like shelter, because of the decades-long war that was perpetuated there, since from 2003 until we still technically have troops on the ground there. And similarly in Afghanistan, we're here talking about Yemen. It's the 1-year anniversary of our withdrawal from Afghanistan. For many of our members of Common Defense, veterans of all backgrounds, especially those who served in Afghanistan over the past 20 years, they have seen firsthand again what that conflict has done to that country, and how, again, I believe the last number we checked was 2.7 million Afghan people have been displaced, and they're refugees now in other countries. We have been beating the drum on the Afghan Adjustment Act and wanting to make sure that we take care of the 80,000 or so Afghans that we brought here to the U.S. during that withdrawal. There are 2.69 million more who are in need of assistance right now, and they're not going to get it either. So, in those situations, sure, we had U.S. boots on the ground, but whether it's boots on the ground or it's money for weapons, whether they're being used defensively or offensively, or fuel for aircraft, if we are perpetuating this conflict, we have to be prepared to pay the cost. And if we're not prepared to pay the cost, then we should stop perpetuating that conflict. When it comes down to it, America has a role, has taken a role in the world, and has decided that we are going to, be on one side or the other of many of these wars. And if we have made that decision as a country, if that's one of the things that we're going to do, then we also have to be willing to pick up the cost of those wars. And if we're not prepared to do that, which I don't think we are, just based on how much we have to fight to provide for basics for the Afghan refugees that we brought here, then we should, not continue to fund this. And I think funding is one thing, one aspect that we talk about a lot. But as Hassan mentioned earlier, the Yemen War Powers Act is another major issue. We swore an oath to the Constitution. The Constitution clearly lays out that war powers belong to Congress. They do not belong to the executive. And as we saw with the previous president, it really doesn't matter who the president is, actually, because we as a country had decided that it shouldn't be in the hands of the king to decide when we go to war or when we don't. And Congress should have that oversight authority. And Congress needs to reassert that authority and reestablish itself as the decider of when or where America goes to war or supports war and conflict in other places. Our elected officials in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, have really abdicated this responsibility, unfortunately, over the past many years. And again, we've seen those costs. And even if you don't, necessarily want to talk about the costs of folks overseas, Americans might say, well, doesn't affect us here at home. Of the over 3 million veterans who served and their families, talk to any of them, and they'll tell you what those costs are themselves. We've heard from many of our members that they have not only sacrificed their lives and their limbs and their mental health, but their family lives and their kids. And all of those things that add up after so many years. And for what? You have to ask yourself, if America is truly about these ideals and these values that we, believe in when we fly the flag, what does that mean in practice? And in practice, that means first and foremost, reducing harm. making sure that the people on the ground in Yemen who are dealing with this day to day don't have to suffer anymore after so many years of going through this. We have a real opportunity right now to end this conflict, end this war, and make it so that people can start rebuilding, because we know that's a years, if not decades long process in and of itself. And so I do want to take a moment and talk to a little bit more with Aisha about some of the things that you're doing in your organization, the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation is doing on the ground there. And you know, what can other people do who are watching at home? What can they do to help?
Thank you very much, Naveed. You know, when Hassan was talking about, and you were talking about the impact of war on populations, Yemen has been severely affected. As I said, we have 19 million people in Yemen who are food insecure. That's about 80% of the Yemeni population. We have 5 million Yemeni children who are malnourished. We have 4 million people who are internally displaced. We don't have people who are refugees because the Saudi blockaded Yemen, so they have no access to get out of Yemen. So the situation in Yemen is extremely dire. There are, you know, millions of families who, you know, cannot even afford one meal a day. And that's the reason I established Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, so that we can do relief work. We do a lot of advocacy work, like, you know, with a lot of advocacy groups, and, you know, and that's something that is one of our mission statement, is to advocate to the end of the war and support peace efforts in Yemen. But we also support a lot of families, whether it's with food distribution, income generation project. We do health projects. We do education project, water project. If people are interested, they can go to our website, yemenfoundation.org, and they will get a sense of all the projects that we do. We are an all-volunteer organization. 100% of our donations go to support people in need. We don't have overhead because we're volunteering here and in Yemen. All the people we work with in Yemen are volunteers as well. So when we look at the, you know, fraction of the funds we use, we have to subscribe to Microsoft and Google's and all of those things. We have over 98% of our funds go to do relief work. We work throughout Yemen, in areas that are controlled by the Presidential Council and areas that are controlled by Ansar Allah. We also reach areas that no other organizations, international or local, reach. Because we work with locals, we're able to get to some of the most underserved populations in Yemen. And a lot of people may not know that Yemen is very much like Afghanistan, by the way, has a lot of mountains. And you have these very small settlements of populations on mountainous regions of Yemen. And so to reach these areas, it's very difficult and very expensive for other organizations. And because we work with the locals in those areas, we're able to reach them. So, you know, I think if I ask people to help us, advocacy would be my number one. Call your representative, call your senator, ask them to support the Yemen War Power Resolution. If people are interested in supporting our work, they're more than welcome, and I will be grateful if they can donate to our work in Yemen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I want to just, yeah, so a comment just came in to post a link to the foundation. I will work on getting that. And why don't I ask a question? So I do want to pose now, just leave some space for us to give questions. So I'm going to put just a little thing there so that people can kind of be reminded to post their questions. And then as we get some of those coming in, I want to kind of specifically think about how not only, right, as we've seen in kind of the anti-war work that we've all done, but particularly in just the context of our global world right now, how kind of I would love to maybe Naveed and anybody else who wants to chime in, kind of thinking through what it feels like or how it looks to see the hypocrisy and how we are seeing a different war in Ukraine kind of be waged, where America is on a very different side of that war, and how that's juxtaposed with what's happening in Yemen and the support, how U.S. support is different in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the war in Ukraine from the very beginning, it's very different, because from the very beginning it was very clear to anyone watching at home who was the good guy and the bad guy, right? War is hell. There's really no good guy or bad guy, but from the outside looking in, Vladimir Putin and the Russian forces invading the sovereign country for their own ends really was, kind of resonated with Americans, especially veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, who saw this as a just war. They saw this as an opportunity to kind of make up for the moral lapses of the invasion of Iraq and the end of the invasion of Afghanistan and other countries where they have served. And I know personally a few veterans who decided they wanted to go volunteer to serve in Ukraine. And we know that, the U.S. has sent billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine to help them defend themselves against Russia. And so I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but I think, for us, the hypocrisy does come up a little bit when we see how quickly and easily we accept, we volunteer to accept Ukrainian refugees, and how quickly and easily we volunteer to send aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, we are still fighting just to provide the basic resources for the Afghan refugees to take care of themselves. And we are still having to sit here and have this conversation because we cannot, the U.S. is still continuing to, whether openly or tacitly support the ongoing conflict in Yemen. It becomes a real difficult situation for us to advocate, continue to advocate for America when we see that going on. And I don't know, Hassan or Aisha, if you have more to add to that.
I agree with a lot of what you just said, Naveed. I think the war in Ukraine, if anything, it is, just on the media lens, we do see a lot of hypocrisy about the way these conflicts are being covered. And a lot of really troubling statements in the media about, well, Ukraine's civilized, and that therefore we should have more empathy for them. But maybe, just maybe, the United States and citizens in the United States are seeing what a conflict looks like from the perspective of the victims of the conflict. And I'm hoping that makes us more sensitive to what war does to people, whether it's Ukraine, in Gaza, in Afghanistan, in Ethiopia, in Yemen, and anywhere. So that's the upshot, is that we have a real chance to grow our empathy. And I think, the war in Ukraine, there's a lot we can do, but that's not a conflict that we can unilaterally, terminate. We can't necessarily unilaterally terminate the war in Yemen, but we have a lot more leverage in this situation to end this conflict. And, for all the bad things going on in the world, we have a truce in Yemen. We are knocking on the door of an end to this conflict, the 7-year war. I mean, we've been, less than a year in Ukraine. Imagine we're now in our 8th year of war in Yemen. Just can't even imagine just the suffering of the Yemeni people. 16 million people on the edge of famine, over 2 million children suffering from acute malnutrition, and who will die without urgent treatment. And not to mention, the generation of trauma that's going to, have to be dealt with, even if this war ends tomorrow. So I think now is the time to, with this hopefully, greater capacity for empathy, that we'll take action and use the leverage we have to end this war now. And then, hopefully start working on, reforming U.S. foreign policy. And I'll just say one more thing is this War Powers Act. If we get this over the finish line and we actually use this to terminate this war, we have set an incredible precedent for ending other unauthorized wars around the world. So this is about Yemen, but it's about something far bigger in the goal to reshape U.S. foreign policy to advance peace building and diplomacy as opposed to just waging endless war.
Yes, yeah, I love that kind of kind of pull out view of that when we can win in some of these areas, whether it's Yemen or Ukraine or in Gaza or in the Palestinian territories, then it makes it easier. We have precedent to then say, look, here's what it looks like. Here's how we can do this. Here's how we can move to a better future without war and without bloodshed. So thank you so much for that, Hassan. Aisha, do you have anything you want to add on that particular piece?
I think Naveed and Hassan spoke to it. As a Yemeni American, it's horrifying to see a war start and to see how it affects population. For someone who knows the war firsthand in Yemen for 8 years, I do not wish for the Ukrainian people to go through that. And I do hope that the US government and everybody else, the European, will sit together and with the Russians and the Ukrainian and end this as soon as possible. I do not want this to continue. I know the destruction and the heartache that will come out of it. It's really depressing. The one thing, is, and Hassan alluded to it as well, is the media attention to that war versus and I call Yemen the blacked out war. I don't think it's forgotten. I think people know about it, but there is an effort not to bring it to the attention of the American public. The Saudis and the Emiratis are very rich and are able to hire a lot of PR firms and pens and even a lot of these advocacy groups that work for them or think tanks. They hire a lot of think tanks that write policy, that talk to representatives and senators. So their narrative of the war is extremely prevalent, and the narrative of the Yemeni people is completely absent. I remember talking to my representative to Adam Smith, and he said that for every single representative in Congress, there is one lobbyist working on behalf of the Saudis. And so you can just imagine the power they have in swaying not just our representatives' points, but also the media and everybody else. And that's why we don't get to hear about Yemen as much.
Yeah.
And I do want to mention that this is something that President Biden, in the beginning of his term, actually said he was going to make this conflict a priority. He appointed a special envoy, and he spoke about it, I think, in a special address about foreign policy, and he talked about how he was planning to end this conflict. And of course, the U.S.'s role in this conflict is limited, and there's only so much that we can do to bring these parties to the table. But I think this war powers resolution is going to be a big part of making sure that this conflict comes to an expedient end, at least from our side, and future situations like this don't arise where we have to kind of pull back, and once military aid starts flowing, it's very difficult to make it stop. And so this is a big part of, again, why we are so supportive of this, because it's not, it's about the humanitarian situation there. It's about what we as veterans have seen in similar situations in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And it's also about the constitutional issues of, who at the end of the day is really in charge of our war powers.
Yeah, I want to add here that, 75% of Saudi arms comes from the US. And 25% of all arms sale from the US go to Saudi Arabia. So if just knowing these numbers, we know that if the US says, we're not going to sell you any more arms, this war is going to stop. And by passing the war power resolution, we are strengthening President Biden's hand in talking to the Saudis. He can say, Congress and the people in the US want this to happen, and there's nothing I can do about it. So we are actually helping him be in a better position to end this.
Sorry if I could jump on that and just say one more thing.
Yeah.
It's actually considering what Aisha just said, that we've literally got 500-600 Saudi lobbyists walking the halls of Congress. That's just Saudi. Then you've got UAE. Then you've got APAC. Then you've got Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing. And that we were able to get the War Powers Act over the finish line to get majorities in both chambers. I think it shows you the power of the War Powers Act. We didn't quite get into the vehicle itself, but what is so important about this is it allows members of Congress to force votes. When we do this in public, when we actually get things on the House floor and on the floor of the Senate, we actually do what the Constitution was meant to do. What we're provided that Congress has to vote and debate if we're going to go to war, and when you do that, then you have a robust discussion and you work out the details. This is the way democracy is supposed to work. So I think that's a critical component and why this vehicle is so important. We have this sitting on the table. We haven't pulled the trigger on forcing a vote yet. I think the lead offices are looking carefully at these truce negotiations. There is an expedited clock. They could pull the trigger and force a vote, but they are, sitting there acting as a deterrent. And our goal here right now is to expand the support that we have. We already have over 114 votes, but we need more senators on this bill. Lots of people that voted for it last time have yet to co-sponsor this time. People like Senator Durbin, really supportive, is not on the bill yet. People like Senator Gillibrand, really supportive, has done a lot for Yemen, is not on the bill yet. People like Senator Murphy has done a lot. He was one of the co-leads of the Yemen War Powers Resolution, has yet to co-sponsor. And so, I know it's August recess. I'm giving people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here, but they need to hear from us and constituents all across the U.S. Know that the Quakers are fired up. We got thousands of Quakers all across the country working on this. We got Yemeni activists working on this and a whole bunch more. I'm sure, Naveed and Jacob will tell us about all the things we need to do now.
Yes. It's such a great little tee off for me too, to do exactly that. And so, yes, thank you all for that. I do want to kind of make sure that we have time for maybe some brief closing remarks as well. So let's get into the get involved section here of what do we do now? We've had, some great discussion over the last 45 minutes about what's happening and kind of how we got to this point and what a future without war could look like. So some of the pieces that we can do right now, and I'm going to add this into the chat as well for everyone. But if you want to help kind of make your voice heard, one of the things that I think Hassan had said specifically was talking to our representatives. Aisha, I think you made the exact same point as well, leading with advocacy. So one of the ways that we can do that is by writing op-eds, writing letters to the editors, and emailing and calling and kind of annoying our elected officials because they work for us. We talked a lot about how much money is involved in this campaign from the Saudi coalition. And one thing that I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's district, and she's a longtime grassroots organizer. I've been doing grassroots organizing for way too long. And one thing that, we always lead with in that space, and that I've heard Congresswoman Omar say so many times, is organized people beat organized money, right? That's how we win so many things. That's how we won the PACT Act when people wanted to try and squash that in the Senate. That's how we won IRA when Coke money and fossil fuel money was trying to shut that down. We win by organizing our people. We win by talking to our friends and our neighbors and our family members across the dinner table to get other people fired up, just as fired up as the Quakers are, just as fired up as the anti-war vets are, and just as fired up as the Yemeni people are. So what I will say is to do that work. We have a packet on Common Defense's website that I'm also putting into the chat. right now, which is just commondefense.us is our website, /get involved, and then /Yemen War Powers Resolution, where you can use our template, use our resources to help put forward your thoughts on why we need less war and why the US should stop being complicit in a Saudi-led war against the Yemeni people. And with that, I am checking all of my little things here to make sure we are still good. And then I want to just turn it over briefly to, let's start with Hassan, and then we'll give Aisha the last word. And Naveed is bowed out of last comments. But Hassan, closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Jacob, Naveed, Aisha. Great discussion. Really great community here. I will say that there are a lot of terrible things happening in the world right now, and there's a lot of things that we really, don't have a lot of power to do much about. But I don't believe that about Yemen. I feel like we are on the cusp of ending this war. And if we come together, really push, this truce is set to expire October 2nd. And so that gives us just, a few short weeks here to really keep the pressure up, get this thing over the finish line, get as much support as we can. And hopefully this can be one of the bright spots that we can build on to start ending these endless wars around the world and, hopefully restoring congressional war powers, as a fundamental part of what U.S. democracy is all about.
Thank you. Yes. And Dr. Juman.
Thank you all for this very interesting and very valuable discussion. I'm honored to be with you all. And again, I will second what Hassan said. This is a golden opportunity for us to push through this. Despite all the money that's thrown at Congress and everything else, we passed this before, and we're going to be able to do it again. It's really us, the constituents, that should have the upper hand and the loudest voice when it comes to this. So I will encourage everyone to, again, contact their representatives, their senators, and encourage them to support the War Power Resolution. This is going to be, like Hassan said, and I agree with him totally, that once this passed and it's signed into law, it will help the U.S. In future wars, that we don't get carelessly enter into future wars, and that they get debated, and hopefully that will end many of the wars that that's happening right now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Jaman for joining us, Hassan and Naveed. Thank you to everybody who watched and tuned in. This will be available on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter to share out again once the recording is stopped. I'm sure it just takes a little bit to process and then should be available for people to share with their friends and their loved ones to get them fired up. And just, again, thanks for continuing to do this work, for being in this fight with us. And we will see everybody soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be with you.